And then I was wondering about global trends in democratization and whether people are right to be worried about decreasing democratization in the world. Yeah, just give me a view of what's happening.
Yeah, I think there's reason to be concerned, and that's in part because of the trends, but also in large part because democracy is such an important thing to try to preserve. I mean, so even if there's a risk of democratic decline in a country that is kind of not too high, but it's, let's say it's a 5% risk over the next 5 years, that would still be worth investing a lot of thought and effort into making that 5% go down to 4 or 3, because it's so important. So in that sense, I think the focus on declining democracies in the world, and how do we deal with it? How do we devise strategies to identify actors, so typically elected leaders who try to undermine democracy? How do we stop them in the tracks before they come so far that they have enough power to basically complete the process? It's been a lot of attention to that, and I think that's really healthy, because this is kind of the more we worry about the state of democracy in one sense, the more alert we become to these often very kind of muddy or hard to detect processes and strategies. So I think kind of our guardrails are stronger in that sense now. We talked more and thought more about autocratization processes over the last few years, especially as a consequence of what happened in the US. I think that also drives a lot of global discussions and academic discussions. So I think in that sense, the more focus there is, the better equipped we are to call out potential autocratization when we see it. So in that sense, it's good. We should be worried. We should focus on it. That being said, I think there's something to both kind of the human mind and also the way media operates. So this kind of being drawn to, and this is not me kind of inventing it. This is basically Daniel Kahneman's and Tversky's work, for example. So kind of being drawn to very dramatic events and things that happen in contexts that are very present to us, and that we read about a lot in the news. So the fact that there's been kind of autocratization processes going on in many large countries recently, and this is quite dramatic often, kind of stability, kind of boring countries such as Norway, for example, are then less reported in international news media. So basically the quality of elections was stable in Norway. Again, that's not something to report on. And that means that it might be, if we're drawing inferences from kind of what we see in terms of autocratization processes in the media or even in academic debate, we're also drawn towards kind of crisis and changes rather than stability. So there are more studies on it. Then we might overestimate the extent of autocratization. And this is, so I think there is a clear downward trend in many democracy indices also, if you look at global averages. So I'm not saying that there hasn't been a decline in democracy level or that there haven't been many autocratization episodes in recent years, but if you look at measures of the share of countries that are going in the wrong direction versus the right direction, so meaning wrong meaning less democracy, right meaning more democracy, being a bit normative here, then kind of in recent years, the autocratizers have been more numerous than the democratizers. So that much is true. And that was not the case if you go back 30 years, right? So, but what is constant across time is that the by far largest share of countries are relatively stable. I mean, so it's not like we're seeing autocratization across the entire world. And very often these things are reversed. I mean, so there are several examples where people feared autocratization and where there seems at least to have been a reversal, often with kind of elections. So Brazil with after Bolsonaro and Poland, for example. So I think that speaks to not exaggerating the threat either. And democracies are, after all, if we look at statistical studies on this, the most resilient political system that are common in politics today. Perhaps besides autocratic monarchies, which are also super stable. So the Gulf monarchies are not necessarily going anywhere in many years. So, but these are very stable regime forms. They're quite resilient. They can take a hit, and very often these kind of autocratization processes are checked and stopped by different events. But kind of being resilient is important. The one thing that worries me then, if I am to end on being a bit pessimistic, is that exactly this fact that many of the countries that have observed autocratization in recent years have been some of the larger and more powerful countries in different regions of the world. So I'm thinking of a country such as India, for example, very populous. And that means that this autocratization process matters a lot more than if it were to take place in the Seychelles or in Mauritius. It's kind of smaller countries, or in Norway for that matter. So it means that a lot of people are experiencing autocratization because it's happening in generally larger countries. We can see that the population weighted average in democracy has gone down much more dramatically in recent years globally than if you weigh all countries equally, regardless of population. The other thing is that what happens in these large, powerful countries can be more influential on what's happening in neighboring countries and in other countries across the world. So imagine kind of looking at Russia as one example, how much influence Vladimir Putin's regime has had on regime developments in other countries, not only in kind of old post-Soviet, kind of former Soviet republics, but also kind of far abroad, trying to undermine kind of enter even in the US elections. So I mean, powerful large countries and autocrats often have an incentive to have other kind of not necessarily have democracies at their borders. So that's worrying to me. But my biggest worry would be if the largest power in the world, if the US were to experience troubles with its democracy, if you were to observe substantial democratic decline in the US, I would be extra worried. So that's what's keeping me up at night, to be honest. I think what's going to happen in the US over the coming years, not only because the US is kind of an established democracy, it's large, it's relatively powerful, and it's kind of influential by example, that's one thing, but also in terms of kind of coalitions between democratic states and basically kind of how that could influence democracy also in other continents. That would worry me. In addition, I think kind of what's going to happen in the Ukraine if Russia were to win out and come out not necessarily strengthened, but at least kind of regain some of its strength and be emboldened. That would also worry me a lot. So basically, I'm keeping my eyes focused on the war in the Ukraine and hoping for a Ukrainian victory. And then I'm also hoping that situation in the US would kind of change in a manner that would make democracy experts and others less worried. I would rather have us not talking about the fragility of US democracy in 10 years.
And then I guess just is there anything you can point to that is being like a particular threat to democracy? I suppose war, like that's a pretty obvious one in Ukraine, but is there like just some ones where it's just like watch out for this thing because this causes instability in democracies, right?
So in terms of very dramatic events, I think when democracy falls in neighboring countries, that's kind of the spillover effects is one thing. Of course, war outcomes, coup attempts, and economic crisis can also shake up any type of regime. So both autocracies and democracies are less stable or kind of they're more fragile whenever there's an economic crisis. But I guess the main threat to democracy in recent decades have been these kind of more gradual processes of leaders trying to consolidate power from within, kind of gradually undermining democratic institutions, so weakening critical civil society organizations, going after the media, trying to kind of demonize and put in place strategies to make life hard for the opposition, not accepting election results, refusing to relinquish power after losing an election. That's often seen as one of the key signals of a well-functioning democracy. So that was extremely worrying to me, and it was kind of well advertised in advance as well, right? So when you have leaders who kind of basically do not seem to subscribe to democratic norms and have other kind of considerations trump them, and pun intended, it was very clear to me, kind of even way before January 6th, that Donald Trump was clearly kind of not willing to play by all the democratic rules of the game and espouse norms that were authoritarian, and that he basically has authoritarian inclinations. And what's dangerous with those types of leaders is that once they consolidate power and stay in power for a long time, and they get to replace kind of people within the state apparatus and build out checks, be it in courts or be it in the military or whatever, that's when it gets really dangerous. So I think the long history and this relative strength of the US institutions made it possible to kind of withstand attempts to derail the functioning of the democratic system. But if you have leaders in place over time and trying to use strategies to kind of a longer term strategy, that's when it becomes dangerous. I would much rather put my money on the US democracy continuing rather than breaking down at different odds now than I would 10, 15 years ago. I guess that's a very common perception both in the US and abroad.
I tend to agree. I think the odds are still relatively low, but the consequences are quite dramatic. So,
Yeah.
yeah.